May 2nd, 1945. In the Kremlin, past midnight, Joseph Stalin stood by the window of his office on the second floor, pipe in hand, looking out over the darkened city. The telephone on his desk had rung 17 times in the past 6 hours. Each call brought news from Berlin, 800 miles to the west, where the Reich that had nearly destroyed his country was collapsing room by room, street by street, life by life. The latest call, 3 minutes ago, had been from Marshal Georgy Zhukov. The German garrison commander, General Helmuth Weidling, had surrendered. Berlin had fallen. Stalin said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned from the window, walked to his desk, and asked Zhukov a single question. "Have you found Hitler's body?" This was not the reaction the world imagined. In movie theaters and history books, in the collective imagination of millions who knew Stalin only as the iron dictator who had beaten Hitler, the moment demanded something different. A triumphant declaration, a fist pounded on a desk, perhaps tears of joy, or a toast with vodka, or a dramatic statement about destiny and revenge. The Soviet people, after losing 27 million of their own, after Leningrad's 900-day siege, after Stalingrad's frozen hell, after the long bleeding march from Moscow to the Oder River, deserved to believe their leader had marked this moment with something grand. But Stalin was not a man who dealt in grand gestures when the cameras were off. And the truth of what he said, what he thought, what he felt when the Red Army reached Berlin reveals something far more complex than triumph. It reveals a mind that could not celebrate even absolute victory without suspicion, without calculation, without immediately asking what could still go wrong. The story of Stalin's reaction begins not on May 2nd, but 11 days earlier, when the news was less certain and the outcome less clear. April 21st, 1945. The first Soviet soldiers crossed into Berlin's outer districts. They were men of the Third Shock Army, part of Zhukov's First Belarusian Front, moving through the northeastern suburbs. They had fought for 1,400 miles to reach this moment, from the Volga River to the gates of the enemy capital. Some of them had been retreating in 1941 when the Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable. Now they were here, in Berlin, and the symbolism was so heavy, it was almost physical. The report reached Stalin by secure telephone at 4 in the afternoon Moscow time. He was in his office with Vyacheslav Molotov, his foreign minister, discussing the upcoming United Nations conference in San Francisco. When the call came through, Stalin listened without interrupting. The aide on the other end of the line, reading from Zhukov's field report, described the entry into the Weissensee district, the resistance encountered, the casualties taken, the prisoners captured. Stalin's face, according to Molotov's later account, showed nothing. No smile, no satisfaction, just the slight narrowing of his eyes that people who knew him recognized as intense focus. When the aide finished, Stalin asked 3 questions. First, what is the strength of German resistance? Second, what are our casualties? Third, has Konev's front entered the city yet? That third question was the revealing one. Ivan Konev commanded the First Ukrainian Front, approaching Berlin from the south. Stalin had deliberately created a competition between Zhukov and Konev, refusing to draw a clear boundary line between their fronts as they approached the city. Both marshals wanted the glory of taking Berlin. Stalin wanted them both to race for it, believing competition would drive them harder. Even now, receiving confirmation that Soviet soldiers stood on German soil in the enemy capital, his mind went immediately to the tactical situation, to the competition he had engineered, to maintaining control. He gave no order to celebrate. He made no statement for posterity. He told the aide to inform Zhukov to maintain pressure, but avoid unnecessary casualties in prestige operations. Then he hung up and returned to discussing the United Nations with Molotov. But something had shifted in him. Molotov noticed it. Stalin lit his pipe, which he did when thinking, and walked to the window. He stood there for perhaps 2 minutes, looking out at nothing in particular. Then he said, more to himself than to Molotov, "So they're finally there. Not triumph, not joy, just acknowledgement. They're finally there." Over the next 9 days, as the Red Army tightened its grip on Berlin, Stalin received updates constantly. The reports came in a rhythm: morning briefing at 9, afternoon update at 4, evening report at 10, and urgent calls whenever something significant happened. Stalin absorbed them all with the same measured attention. He would listen, ask questions, give orders, and show almost nothing of what he felt. The questions he asked revealed his priorities. He wanted to know about casualties. He wanted to know about German resistance strength. He wanted to know about the location of Western Allied forces. He wanted to know about the Reichstag, that symbolic building whose capture would represent ultimate victory. And he wanted to know over and over about Hitler. Where was Hitler? Was he still in Berlin? Had he fled? Was he alive? Dead? Captured? Stalin's obsession with Hitler's fate was not about revenge, or at least not primarily about revenge. It was about verification. Stalin trusted nothing he could not verify. He had built an entire system of government on the principle of checking and double-checking, of assuming everyone lied, of believing only what could be proven. The idea that Hitler might escape, might flee to the West, might cut a deal with the Americans and British, haunted him. He had spent the final year of the war terrified that the Western Allies would make a separate peace with Germany, leaving the Soviet Union to face the Wehrmacht alone again. Even now, with Berlin surrounded and the Third Reich in its death throes, he could not quite believe it was over. April 25th. The Red Army completed the encirclement of Berlin. Over 400,000 German soldiers and the Volkssturm militia were trapped inside, along with roughly 2.5 million civilians. Soviet forces numbered over 2 million men, with thousands of tanks and artillery pieces. The outcome was no longer in doubt. It was only a question of time and blood. Stalin received this news during a meeting of the State Defense Committee. The report came from General Alexei Antonov, Deputy Chief of the General Staff. Stalin listened, then looked around the table at the faces of the men who had run the war with him: Molotov, Lavrenti Beria, Georgy Malenkov, Anastas Mikoyan. These were not sentimental men. They had survived Stalin's purges, the near disaster of 1941, the grinding horror of the Eastern Front. They knew better than to show emotion prematurely. Stalin nodded slowly. "Good," he said. Just that one word. Then he moved to the next item on the agenda, which concerned coal production in the Donbass region. But after the meeting ended, he kept Beria behind. Beria ran the NKVD, the secret police, and also oversaw Soviet intelligence operations. Stalin wanted to know everything Beria's agents had learned about Hitler's location. Beria reported that intelligence suggested Hitler was in the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, in the government district near the center of Berlin. Stalin asked if this was confirmed. Beria admitted it was not confirmed, only highly probable based on multiple sources. Stalin's response, recorded in Beria's notes from that evening, was characteristic. Highly probable is not the same as certain. Find out. I want confirmation. This was Stalin's war, not the war of grand strategy and sweeping offensives, though he had learned to conduct those too, but the war of verification, of paranoid certainty, of trusting nothing until proven. He could not celebrate Berlin's fall until he knew Hitler's fate, because he could not trust that victory was real until he could see the enemy's corpse. April 30th. The assault on the Reichstag began. This was the moment Stalin had been waiting for more than any other. The Reichstag, the German parliament building, had become the symbol of Nazi power in Soviet propaganda. Never mind that the Nazis had barely used it, that it had burned in 1933 and never been fully restored, that it was militarily insignificant. It was the symbol and symbols mattered. Stalin had personally ordered that the Reichstag be taken before May 1st, which was International Workers' Day, the great Soviet holiday. He wanted to announce the capture on May Day, wanted that symbolic victory on that symbolic date. Units of the 3rd Shock Army, particularly the 150th Rifle Division, were given the honor and the burden of the assault. The fighting was savage. German defenders, including SS troops and Hitler Youth, turned the massive stone building into a fortress. Soviet soldiers fought room to room, floor to floor, sometimes hand to hand. The casualties mounted, but by late afternoon on April 30th, Soviet soldiers had reached the roof. At 6 in the evening Berlin time, 7 in the evening Moscow time, 2 sergeants, Mikhail Yegorov and Meliton Kantaria, raised the Soviet victory banner over the Reichstag's dome. The moment was captured by photographers who arrived shortly after, restaging the scene to get better images. But the moment itself was real. The banner, red with hammer and sickle, flew over the building that represented Hitler's Reich. Stalin received the news at 7:30. He was having dinner, a simple meal of soup and bread, which was his habit during the war. An aide knocked and entered, apologizing for the interruption. Stalin gestured for him to speak. The aide reported that the Reichstag had been taken, that the victory banner had been raised, that fighting continued inside but the building was secured. Stalin set down his spoon. He looked at the aide for a moment, then nodded. "Good," he said. Then, after a pause, "What are our casualties?" The aide gave the numbers. Stalin absorbed them without visible reaction. Then he asked, "Has Hitler been found?" The aide said no, not yet. Stalin picked up his spoon and returned to his soup. "Then the war is not over," he said. But something in him had eased. The Reichstag was taken. The symbol was secured. Whatever else happened, that victory could not be taken away. After dinner, he went to his office and placed a call to Zhukov. The conversation, according to Zhukov's memoirs, was brief. Stalin congratulated him on taking the Reichstag. Then he said, "Now find Hitler. I want his body. I want proof." Zhukov promised to do everything possible. Stalin said, "Do more than everything possible. Find him." That same evening, though Stalin did not yet know it, Hitler was already dead. He had shot himself in his bunker at 3:30 that afternoon, shortly before the Soviet banner was raised over the Reichstag. His body had been carried outside, doused with gasoline, and burned in a shell crater in the Reich Chancellery garden. The remains would not be found for 2 more days, and even then, identification would be uncertain, contested, confused. May 1st. Stalin made no announcement about the Reichstag. He waited. He wanted May Day to be about the Reichstag victory, but reports from Berlin indicated the fighting was still intense in other parts of the city. The symbolism would be wrong if he announced victory while Soviet soldiers were still dying in Berlin streets. So he waited, and May Day passed without the grand announcement he had planned. This patience, this willingness to let a symbolic moment pass rather than claim premature victory, was unusual for Stalin. It suggested how deeply he had internalized the lessons of the war. In 1941, he had made catastrophic errors by refusing to believe intelligence about the German invasion, by trusting his political instincts over military reality. The war had taught him, slowly and painfully, that reality did not bend to his will. He had learned to wait for confirmation. May 2nd. The end came not with a dramatic battle, but with exhaustion. General Weidling, commanding the Berlin garrison, realized further resistance was pointless. His men were out of ammunition, out of food, out of hope. Civilians were dying by the thousands in the crossfire. At 1 in the morning, he sent officers under white flags to Soviet lines to negotiate surrender. By 6 in the morning, the surrender was formalized. Weidling broadcast orders for all German forces in Berlin to cease resistance. The battle was over. Berlin had fallen. The news reached Stalin at 7:30 in the morning. He was already awake, already in his office, reading intelligence reports. The call came from Zhukov. Stalin listened to the report of Weidling's surrender, the cessation of organized resistance, the beginning of mopping up operations. When Zhukov finished, Stalin asked the question he had been asking for 11 days. "Have you found Hitler?" Zhukov said no, not yet, but they were searching. Soviet troops had located the Reich Chancellery and the bunker beneath it. They had found bodies, but none confirmed as Hitler. Stalin said, "Keep searching, I want confirmation." Then, according to Zhukov's account, Stalin said something else. His voice, which had been flat and businesslike throughout the conversation, took on a different quality. Quieter, but with an edge of something that might have been satisfaction or might have been contempt. He said, "So that's the end of the bastard." This is one of the few moments where Stalin's words suggested emotion. Not triumph, not joy, but a kind of grim satisfaction mixed with contempt for the enemy who had brought such ruin to Europe and to the Soviet Union. The bastard, not the Führer, not Hitler, not even the enemy. The bastard, personal, dismissive, final. But even this moment of feeling was immediately followed by practicality. Stalin told Zhukov to secure all German government buildings, to seize all documents, to round up any high-ranking Nazis who might still be alive. He wanted the German nuclear research facilities secured. He wanted scientists captured before the Americans could get them. He wanted patents, blueprints, anything of technical value. Berlin was not just a military victory. It was a treasure trove of German technology and knowledge, and Stalin wanted it all. The call ended. Stalin sat at his desk for a moment, then stood and walked to the window. It was a grey morning in Moscow, cool for May. He lit his pipe and looked out over the city that had nearly fallen to the Germans in 1941, when advance units of the Wehrmacht had reached Moscow's outskirts and Stalin had briefly considered evacuating. He had stayed. The city had held. And now, nearly 4 years later, it was German capital that had fallen. What did he feel in that moment? We cannot know for certain. Stalin was not a man who confided his feelings, even to his diary. But we can infer from his actions, from the accounts of those who saw him that day. Molotov visited his office mid-morning and later told his own aides that Stalin seemed satisfied, but not celebratory. Beria came in the afternoon to report on NKVD operations in Berlin and noted that Stalin was focused on practical matters, not dwelling on the victory. What emerges from these accounts is a portrait of a man who could not fully celebrate even total victory. Stalin's mind was already moving forward. What about the Japanese? The Soviet Union was still neutral in the Pacific War, but Stalin had promised to enter it 3 months after Germany's defeat. What about the occupation zones in Germany? Would the Western Allies honor the agreements made at Yalta? What about Eastern Europe? How could he secure Soviet control over Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary? What about the atomic bomb? His spies had told him the Americans were close to testing a nuclear weapon. How would that change the post-war balance of power? Berlin's fall was not an ending for Stalin. It was a transition. One set of problems had been resolved. 100 new ones were emerging. May 3rd. Soviet search teams found burned human remains in the Reich Chancellery garden. The condition of the bodies made identification difficult, but dental records and other evidence eventually suggested they were Hitler and Eva Braun, his wife of one day. But the identification was not certain, and Stalin refused to announce it publicly. His paranoia about Hitler possibly escaping was so deep that he would not confirm Hitler's death for months, even to his Western allies. When President Truman asked Stalin at the Potsdam Conference in July whether Hitler was dead, Stalin said he did not know for certain. This refusal to confirm what he almost certainly believed to be true reveals something essential about Stalin's reaction to Berlin's fall. He could not trust it, even with the city in ruins, even with the Wehrmacht destroyed, even with German surrender imminent. He could not trust that it was really over. Some part of him, shaped by decades of paranoia and by the near disaster of 1941, could not believe in victory until every possible doubt was eliminated. May 8th. Germany signed the instrument of unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. Stalin insisted on a second signing ceremony in Berlin the next day, May 9th, because he did not trust the ceremony in Reims, France, where the first surrender was signed. He wanted a surrender signed on German soil, with Soviet representatives present, with no possibility of ambiguity or Western manipulation. On the evening of May 9th, Stalin finally addressed the Soviet people by radio. His speech was not the triumphant declaration one might expect. It was measured, almost bureaucratic. He acknowledged the victory, praised the Red Army and the Soviet people, listed the countries liberated from Nazi occupation, but his tone was flat, his words careful. He did not gloat. He did not threaten. He simply stated facts. Near the end of the speech, he said something that revealed his deeper thoughts. He said the victory had been achieved at the cost of enormous sacrifices and privations. 27 million Soviet citizens were dead. The Western Soviet Union was devastated. Cities were rubble, villages were ashes. The economy was shattered. Stalin knew these costs intimately, had received reports on them throughout the war. The victory was real, but it was not clean or simple or purely joyful. It was a victory built on a mountain of corpses, and Stalin knew it. After the speech, Stalin hosted a reception in the Kremlin for military commanders and government officials. This was the closest he came to celebration. Toasts were made. Vodka was poured. Zhukov, Konev, and other marshals were praised. Stalin himself raised a glass and offered a toast to the Soviet people, to their resilience and sacrifice. But even here, witnesses noted that Stalin seemed distracted, his mind elsewhere. What was he thinking about? We have some clues. Later that evening, after most of the guests had left, Stalin spoke with Beria about the situation in Poland. The provisional government in Warsaw was still not fully under Soviet control. There were resistance fighters, remnants of the home army that had fought both Germans and Soviets. Stalin wanted them eliminated. Berlin had fallen, but the work of securing Soviet power in Eastern Europe was just beginning. This was Stalin's true reaction to Berlin's fall. Not celebration, but calculation. Not joy, but the immediate assessment of what came next. The war had taught him that survival required constant vigilance, that victory was temporary, that power was the only reliable security. Berlin's fall proved the Red Army could defeat the Wehrmacht. But what did it prove about the coming confrontation with the West? What did it prove about the Soviet Union's ability to maintain its gains? In the weeks after Berlin's fall, Stalin's behavior showed his priorities clearly. He ordered the systematic looting of German industrial equipment, which was dismantled and shipped east to rebuild Soviet industry. He ordered the arrest of thousands of Germans who might be useful: scientists, engineers, administrators. He ordered the NKVD to begin operations against potential resistance in occupied territories. He began maneuvering to ensure communist governments in Eastern Europe. He accelerated the Soviet atomic bomb program. These were not the actions of a man savoring victory. They were the actions of a man who understood that Berlin's fall was not an ending, but a beginning. The war against Nazi Germany was over. The struggle for post-war Europe was just starting. There is one more moment worth noting. In June 1945, Stalin held a victory parade in Moscow. It was a massive display. Thousands of soldiers marching through Red Square, captured German banners thrown at the foot of Lenin's mausoleum, tanks and artillery rolling past the reviewing stand. Stalin stood on the mausoleum, watching it all, smoking his pipe. A photographer captured his face in that moment. It shows a man who looks tired, older than his 66 years. His expression is not triumphant. It is something closer to grim satisfaction, or perhaps just exhaustion. The face of a man who has won but knows the cost, who has achieved victory but cannot trust it, who has defeated one enemy but sees others emerging. This was Stalin's reaction to the Red Army reaching Berlin. Not the dramatic declaration of triumph that history might have expected. Not the emotional release of 4 years of war. Instead, a measured, suspicious, calculating response from a man who had learned that victory was never final, that enemies were everywhere, that survival required constant vigilance. He had asked for confirmation of Hitler's death. He had focused on casualties and tactical details. He had immediately begun planning the next phase of Soviet expansion. He had refused to celebrate until every doubt was eliminated, and even then, his celebration was muted, practical, brief. So that's the end of the bastard. That was what Stalin said when he learned the Red Army had reached Berlin. Not a grand statement for the history books, not a moment of theatrical triumph. Just a few words of grim satisfaction, followed immediately by the question he had been asking all along. Have you found the body? This was the reality of Stalin's reaction. Not the myth of the triumphant dictator savoring his greatest victory, but the truth of a paranoid, calculating survivor who could not trust even absolute victory, who could not celebrate even total triumph, who could not rest even when the enemy capital lay in ruins. Berlin had fallen. The war was ending. But for Stalin, the struggle was never over. There was always another enemy, another threat, another battle to fight. That was how he had survived the purges, the invasion, the near defeat of 1941. That was how he would approach the peace. Not with joy or relief or satisfaction, but with the same suspicious vigilance that had defined his entire rule. The Red Army had reached Berlin. Stalin had won, but he could not celebrate, because in his mind he could never truly win. Victory was temporary. Enemies were eternal. Survival required constant struggle. That was the lesson of his life, and Berlin's fall did not change it. So when the telephone rang on May 2nd, 1945, and Marshal Zhukov reported that Berlin had surrendered, Stalin's reaction was entirely consistent with who he was. He acknowledged the fact. He asked about casualties. He demanded confirmation of Hitler's death. He gave orders for the next phase of operations, and then he returned to work, because the work was never done, the struggle was never over, and victory was never secure. That was what Stalin said and did and thought when he learned the Red Army had reached Berlin. Not triumph, but transition. Not celebration, but calculation. Not an ending, but a beginning. The truth is less dramatic than the myth, but it reveals far more about the man who led the Soviet Union through its darkest hour and emerged victorious, but never satisfied, never secure, never able to trust even his greatest triumph.